Picture the Amazon rainforest. It's not just a forest. It's a force of nature so vast, it creates its own weather. A world teeming with an almost unimaginable density of life. A single hectare can hold more tree species than all of North America. It's a place that breathes, exhaling a river of water vapor into the sky that falls back down as torrential, life-giving rain. It is the wettest, most biodiverse ecosystem on Earth. A world drowning in life. Now, travel less than 1,000 miles west, just over the towering spine of the Andes Mountains. You step onto a different planet. You are in the Atacama Desert in Chile, the driest non-polar desert in the world. There are weather stations here that have never recorded a single drop of rain. Not in decades. The ground is so sterile, so stripped of life, that NASA uses it to test rovers for Mars. It is a landscape of bone-dry rock and salt, a place where life has lost its grip almost completely. This is one of the great geographical paradoxes on our planet. The wettest place on Earth, and the driest, separated by a distance you could drive in a day. It's a contrast so stark, so absolute, that it seems to break the rules. How can two such extremes exist side by side? How can a wall of mountains create both a paradise of life and a valley of death? This isn't just a simple rain shadow. This is something else entirely, a profound climate mystery. If you're using these to fall asleep, that's literally why I make them. So subscribe, maybe, and tell me, where are you and what time? I check comments, and it's like Berlin at breakfast, Boston at bedtime, all at once. To solve this mystery, we can't just look at a map. We need to look at a calendar, a geological calendar. Because the answer to this profound paradox doesn't lie in the South America of today. It lies in a lost world. Let's step into a time machine. Our destination. This same exact spot, but our clock is set for 20 million years ago, to an age scientists call the Miocene epoch. As you step out, the air is thick, warm, and overwhelmingly humid. But it's the landscape that feels impossibly wrong. Look west. Where the towering, sky-piercing wall of the Andes should be, there is just a low, green spine of rolling hills. The colossal mountain range that defines the continent today simply isn't there. And because the Andes don't exist yet, everything else is different. The entire interior of the continent isn't a rainforest. It's an immense system of wetlands and swamps, a shallow inland sea that stretches for thousands of miles, draining into a system of colossal rivers. But here is the single mind-bending twist. Those rivers aren't flowing east towards the Atlantic, like the Amazon does today. They are flowing west, carving their way through gaps in those low hills and emptying into the Pacific Ocean. The Amazon wasn't just different, it was flowing backwards. So what happened? What unimaginable force could buckle a continent, raise a mountain range taller than the Himalayas from a line of hills, and reverse the flow of the mightiest river on Earth? That last question, that's the big one. The kind of question that rewrites textbooks. And like any great detective story, the first step to solving an impossible puzzle is to look at the evidence left at the scene. The clues were there all along, scattered across the continent, but they were so bizarre, so out of place, that for a long time they just seemed like geological quirks. Imagine you're hiking high in the Andes, 4,000 meters above sea level in the thin, cold air, and you look down and you find a fossil, not of a mountain goat, a seashell, then another, then the fossilized vertebra of an ancient whale. These aren't creatures of the mountains. They belong on the seabed, crushed under kilometers of water. It's like finding a sunken shipwreck on the observation deck of the Empire State Building. It makes no sense. But wait, the story gets weirder. Travel east, into the barren, cracked earth of what is now the Atacama Desert. the driest place on Earth. And what do we find buried there? The bones of colossal swamp-dwelling crocodiles. Creatures like Purosaurus, a 10-ton monster that hunted in a lush, wet world. A world of immense rivers and sprawling wetlands. His bones are buried in a place that hasn't seen rain in a human lifetime. These aren't just curiosities. They are the fingerprints of the culprit. Seashells on the roof of the world. Swamp monsters in the heart of the desert. The evidence screams a single stark conclusion. This land has been subjected to unimaginable violence. The entire continent has been buckled, twisted, and turned inside out. So, we have a crime scene. A continent turned upside down. The obvious culprit seems to be brute force tectonics. The Nazca Plate shoves its way under South America, and over millions of years, that colossal, slow-motion collision heaves the Andes Mountains into the sky. And for a long time, the story we told ourselves was simple. The mountains rise, and they act like a wall. They block the moisture-rich winds coming from the Pacific, casting a vast rain shadow that helps create the Atacama. At the same time, this new continental spine forces the weather systems to change, drawing in moisture from the warm Atlantic Ocean instead. The Amazon basin, now trapped between the Andes and the Atlantic, becomes a gigantic greenhouse. The climate changes, and the rainforest is born as a result. It's a neat, tidy explanation. The landscape is a passive stage, and global climate is the actor. The Amazon is simply what happens when you build a mountain range in the wrong place. It's a consequence, a victim of geography. But what if that's not the whole story? What if it's not even the most important part of the story? What if we've been looking at it completely backwards? The prevailing theory sees the Amazon as a result of the climate. But an incredible, paradigm-shifting idea began to take hold. What if the rainforest wasn't the result of the wet climate, but the cause of it? What if the ecosystem itself wasn't a passive passenger, but the very engine driving the continental rain machine? Think about that for a second. It turns the entire mystery on its head. The forest isn't just sitting there, soaking up rain that happens to fall. It's an active participant. A biological machine that reaches out, grabs moisture from the ocean, and pumps it thousands of miles inland, engineering its own survival on a continental scale. The victim becomes the architect. But how could a collection of trees, no matter how vast, achieve something so impossibly grand? How could life hijack geology and command the clouds? To answer that, we have to look at a secret power, a hidden force that lives inside every single leaf. This idea of the forest as an architect, it turns the whole story on its head. It's a profound, almost unbelievable claim. A biological machine creating its own weather on a continental scale. But before we can even begin to prove a theory that wild, we have to go back to the crime scene and establish the timeline. We need to know, with precision, when the Andes actually grew high enough to become the wall they are today. If they rose slowly, over tens of millions of years, then the old story of gradual climate change might still hold water. But if they rose fast, that changes everything. So how do you put a stopwatch on a mountain? How do you measure the height of a landscape that existed millions of years before humans ever did? The answer, it turns out, is a masterclass in scientific detective work. It wasn't found by looking at the rocks themselves, but by listening to the ghosts of ancient rain. Every time a cloud forms over the ocean and drifts inland, it carries a hidden code. The water vapor is made of molecules, but not all water molecules are created equal. Some contain a slightly heavier form of oxygen, an isotope called oxygen-18. Others contain the normal, lighter oxygen-16. Picture a hiker starting at the bottom of a mountain with a backpack full of heavy bowling balls and light tennis balls. As they climb and it starts to rain, the heavy bowling balls are the first to fall out. The higher they go, the more of the heavy stuff gets left behind. By the time they reach the summit, their pack is almost entirely filled with the lighter tennis balls. Clouds do the exact same thing. As they are forced up the side of a mountain, the heavier water molecules with oxygen 18 rain out first at lower altitudes. The rain that falls near the summit is almost entirely made of the lighter water. The chemical signature of the rain is a direct fingerprint of its altitude. This is the clue: the smoking gun. Scientists realized that if they could find minerals that formed in contact with that ancient rainwater, they could analyze their chemistry and read the altitude. They found them in ancient soil deposits, in tiny carbonate minerals that had crystallized millions of years ago, locking that high altitude or low altitude rain signature into their very structure. It's like finding a whole box of fossilized altimeters. So they began collecting samples, dating them, and reading their chemical codes. For the first time, they could build a growth chart for the Andes, a direct timeline of the uplift. And what they found shattered the old story. The Andes didn't just rise, they exploded upwards. The data showed that a massive portion of the central Andes shot up between 10 and 6 million years ago, gaining more than half their modern height in a geological instant. A period of shocking, violent growth that happened far more recently and far more quickly than anyone had ever imagined. This discovery creates a terrifying new puzzle. A mountain range doesn't just double its height without triggering a climate apocalypse. This wasn't a gentle change. It was a catastrophe. It happened too fast for the continental climate to just adjust. So, faced with this sudden violent upheaval, their life-giving winds from the Pacific choked off in a geological moment, what did the Amazon ecosystem do? Did it wither and die? Or did it fight back? So, we have a timeline for the mountains, an explosive recent growth spurt that changed a continent. But that's only one side of the story. That's the testimony of the rock. What about the river? How do you get a river to tell you its own life story? How do you ask it where it was born, how it lived, and when it was turned completely upside down? You can't. But you can read the diary it's been writing for millions of years. Picture the mouth of the Amazon, where it pours into the Atlantic Ocean. For millions of years, the river has been carrying a colossal burden of ground-up rock and sand, sediment, and dumping it onto the seafloor. This hasn't just created a delta, it has built a monument, an underwater mountain range of mud and sand called the Amazon Fan, stretching for hundreds of miles across the ocean floor. It's a library, with each layer of sediment representing a chapter in the river's history. And in the 1990s, scientists on a deep-sea drilling vessel did something incredible. They drilled into that fan. They pulled up massive, continuous cores of sediment, some over 1 kilometer long. It was like taking a biopsy of deep time. In the bottom layers of these cores, from before 10 million years ago, they found something that confirmed the lost world. The sediment was composed of old, weathered minerals from the ancient continental shield in the east. The grain sizes were small. It was the signature of a river system that was relatively gentle, meandering, and draining a very different landscape. And then, in a layer dating to just under 10 million years ago, everything changes. It is one of the most dramatic scenes ever pulled from the geological record. The amount of sediment suddenly, violently, increases by an order of magnitude. It's not a gentle transition. It's an explosion. The river has become a fire hose pointed at the Atlantic. But it's not just the amount, it's the type of sediment. Suddenly, the core is flooded with fresh, unweathered minerals. Grains of feldspar, mica, and quartz that have a distinct chemical fingerprint. A fingerprint that could only come from one place. The young, rapidly rising Andes Mountains, thousands of kilometers to the west. It's like finding Himalayan sand in the mud of the Mississippi River. An impossible signal. The river's source had flipped. The evidence was now absolute. The fossils told us the continent was turned upside down. The rainwater isotopes told us when the mountains exploded upwards. And now, the sediment cores told us exactly when the Amazon River was born. It wasn't a slow, gentle reversal. It was a catastrophic rerouting. The moment the Andes became a wall, a new, monstrously powerful river was unleashed, tearing down the new mountains and dumping their remains into the ocean with unimaginable force. The stage for the modern Amazon was set, not with a gentle shift in climate, but with a geological cataclysm. So we have our timeline, a moment of geologic violence, a new mountain wall, a new monster river. The old world is gone. This brings us back to the central, terrifying question. Faced with this catastrophe, faced with the death of their old world, how did the plants and animals of the basin not just wither and die? How did a forest hijack this geological chaos and build a paradise? With the timeline set, the stage is now built. The violent, explosive rise of the Andes has slammed a colossal wall of rock into the sky, thousands of kilometers long and miles high. The old world is gone, and in its place, a new, brutal climate engine has been switched on. You've probably heard of the mechanism. Geologists call it a rain shadow, but that name is too gentle, too understated for what happened here. This wasn't a shadow. This was a verdict, a permanent division of the world into two opposite extremes. Here's how it works. First, look west. For millions of years, the life-giving moisture for the continent had come from the Pacific Ocean. But now, that supply is cut off. Completely. That new Andean wall is so high, it blocks virtually all of the humid ocean air from ever reaching the western coast of South America. The land on the Pacific side, once wet and lush, is now starved of water. A death sentence delivered by geology. This is the birth of the Atacama. But it's what happens on the other side of the wall that creates the paradox. Picture the air moving west from the Atlantic Ocean. It's not just air. It's a vast, invisible river, saturated with staggering amounts of water vapor, scooped up from the warm tropical sea. Now, imagine this river of moisture is a colossal, sopping wet sponge. As it moves inland, it hits the Andes. The only way to go is up. And as that immense sponge of air is forced higher and higher up the eastern face of the mountains, it cools. And just like wringing out a sponge, the cooling forces the water to drop out as rain. Torrential, relentless, unimaginable rain. The air is squeezed completely dry, dumping its entire liquid cargo onto the eastern slopes and the vast basin below. The result is a perfect machine for creating extremes. On the western side, a permanent drought, a landscape so dry it becomes alien. And on the eastern side, a basin that receives not just a little rain, but nearly all the moisture that an entire ocean can provide. The mountains built the walls of a gigantic greenhouse. The rain shadow effect started to fill it with water. But here's the thing. This physical mechanism, as powerful as it is, still doesn't quite explain the sheer scale of the Amazon. It explains a wet climate. It doesn't explain a world that creates its own weather, a forest that actively pumps a river of water vapor thousands of miles inland from the ocean. The mountains may have built the engine, but something else had to turn the key and floor the accelerator. The catastrophe had set the stage for a wet world, but it was life itself that would hijack this new system and turn it into a paradise. So the first act in the life of the modern Andes was one of annihilation, the birth of the Atacama, a brutal, definitive act of geological execution that starved an entire coastline of its water and condemned it to an eternity of sterile dust. And if the story ended there, it would still be one of the most incredible tales of transformation on our planet. A story of destruction on an unimaginable scale. But here is the profound, mind-bending secret of the Andes. The creation of the desert wasn't the main event. It was a side effect, a consequence. Because the mountain's true purpose wasn't destructive, it was creative. You see, the Andes didn't just build a wall, they tilted a continent. They committed a geological heist, stealing the allegiance of every drop of rain that fell east of their peaks. Before the uplift, the continent's plumbing was aimed at the Pacific. Afterwards, that entire system was beheaded, its old westward flowing arteries severed, and a new colossal circulatory system was forged, aimed squarely at the Atlantic. This wasn't just a rain shadow. This was a complete replumbing of South America, the creation of a new continental watershed, a basin of truly epic proportions, designed to capture and hold the moisture from an entire ocean. The mountains had done their part. They had laid the foundation, they had built the arena and filled it with water. But a basin, no matter how vast, isn't a rainforest. It's just raw material. To become the living, breathing world we know today, that raw power needed a tenant. An engineer, a guiding intelligence. And it was about to get one. So what happens when you violently replumb an entire continent? When you build a new mountain range and tilt the land, severing the ancient arteries of a river system that has flowed the same way for millions of years? The result is not subtle, it is catastrophic. The rising Andes hadn't just built a wall, they had built a dam. A tectonic dam thousands of kilometers long and miles high, slammed directly into the path of that ancient, westward flowing drainage system. Imagine those colossal rivers, carrying the water from half a continent, running the course they had for an eternity. Suddenly, they slam into a newly risen wall of solid rock. The water had nowhere to go, and so it began to back up. It pooled, it spread, it drowned the interior of the continent under a massive, shallow, inland sea. This wasn't just a flood, this was the birth of a lost world, a sprawling, brackish, semi-salty mega-wetland that covered almost all of what we now call Western Amazonia. Geologists have a name for this drowned continent. They call it the Pebas system. And right here, this is the moment. This is where all the dots connect. All those out-of-place clues we found earlier. The fossils that made no sense. This is the world they belong to. Those bones of colossal, swamp-dwelling crocodiles found in the hyper-arid Atacama. This was their hunting ground. The seashells and whale vertebrae found high in the Andes. They once lay on the floor of this immense, continent-spanning sea, before the final violent phase of the uplift scooped them up and thrust them toward the sky. The evidence was telling one unified story. The Andes rose, and in their shadow, they created a magnificent temporary monster. A waterlogged world that set the stage for the next, and most incredible, act in the Amazon's story. The arena was finally complete. The great flood had come. Now, life itself had to answer. How do you survive in a drowned world? So, what did it look like, living in this drowned world, the Pebas system? Picture it. This isn't a lake, and it isn't an ocean. It is a labyrinth of water that stretches to the horizon in every direction. A vast, warm, murky sea, the colour of milky tea, dotted with swampy, shifting islands of mud and rotting vegetation. The air is thick, wet, and heavy. It's a world without solid ground, a kingdom of water that has swallowed a continent. And in this kingdom, there were kings. The apex predator here was not a mammal. It was a reptile of almost unbelievable scale, A caiman, cousin to the crocodiles and alligators of today, called Purosaurus. But this was no ordinary caiman. This was a monster that grew over 10 meters long, heavier than a city bus, with a skull the size of a bathtub. Its jaws were instruments of absolute power, capable of bone-shattering force that would make a T-Rex look gentle. When a Purosaurus hunted, it wasn't a chase, it was a geological event. But the giants didn't stop there. Grazing on the soft water plants in this endless swamp were turtles so massive their shells were the size of a small car. Creatures called stupendomies, the stupendous turtle, who were so large that not even the mighty Purosaurus would dare to attack a full-grown adult. They were living armoured islands, moving slowly through a world that had existed like this for millions of years. And weaving through the murky chaos were creatures that hint at the world to come. Dolphins, but not like any we know today. These were specialized freshwater species, adapted for this bizarre ecosystem, with unusually long snouts for probing the soft mud, using their sonar to navigate a world where sight was almost useless. This was life's answer to the Great Flood. It didn't just survive, it specialized, it thrived. It grew to monstrous proportions, creating a stable, uniquely adapted ecosystem that was one of the strangest and most magnificent in our planet's history. This aquatic empire reigned for millions of years, a world seemingly built to last forever. So where did it go? How does a continental sea teeming with giants simply vanish and give way to a forest? That aquatic empire, the Pebas system, reigned for millions of years, a world seemingly built to last forever. But it wasn't. It was a time bomb. Think about the physics. On one side, the Andes are still rising, still tilting the continent, relentlessly pouring more and more water into this gigantic basin. On the other side, an old, ancient wall of rock, the Brazilian and Guiana shields, is all that's holding the water back from the Atlantic. It's a bathtub being filled by a fire hose with no drain, and the water level just keeps rising. The pressure keeps building, year after year, millennium after millennium. Something had to give. And then, one day, somewhere around 9 million years ago, it did. We don't know what the final trigger was. A minor earthquake. A particularly wet millennium. But a weak point in that eastern wall of rock was found. Maybe a trickle of water found a fault line. A seep became a stream became a torrent. And the entire continent-spanning dam failed. This wasn't a flood. This was a geological exorcism. An entire inland sea, a body of water the size of the Mediterranean, emptying itself with unimaginable, catastrophic violence. It was an ocean on the move, carving its new path to the sea, not over millennia, but in a geological instant. Weeks, months, maybe a few years, a singular event of creation through destruction. The roar must have been absolute. The ground-shaking power of 1 billion tons of water, mud and rock grinding a new canyon 1,000 kilometers long. When the chaos subsided and the water was gone, the Pebas system was no more. The great aquatic giants, the Purosaurus and the Stupendomies, were left stranded in an endless sea of mud. Their kingdom vanished from beneath them. Their world was over. In its place, a scar, a raw, gaping wound torn across the face of the continent. But this scar was also a cradle. It was the newly carved channel of the Amazon River, now flowing east, exactly where it does today. The Great Flood had delivered a new artery of life, and all around it, a vast, empty, muddy canvas, waiting for a painter. The violence was over. The great inland sea was gone, drained away in a geological blink of an eye. In its place, a raw, 1,000-kilometer scar. A new river, born from catastrophe. But this river wasn't just an instrument of destruction. It was an agent of creation, on an almost unimaginable scale. This was the birth of the modern Amazon, and it came bearing gifts. Think of it as the greatest conveyor belt ever constructed, a system stretching thousands of kilometers from the towering peaks of the new Andes all the way to the Atlantic Ocean. And it didn't just carry water, it carried the mountains themselves, ground into a fine, fertile dust. Geologists call it sediment, but you can think of it as gold dust for biology. This wasn't the sterile, brackish mud of the old Pebas Sea. This was a rich, potent cocktail of fresh minerals, phosphorus, potassium, all the essential building blocks for life, liberated from the young Andean rock by the river's immense grinding power, and delivered free of charge across the entire basin. Every year the river would swell, overflowing its banks and smothering the landscape for thousands of square kilometers. But this wasn't a destructive flood. It was an act of absolute renewal, a continental-scale top-dressing of fertilizer. The river was a farmer, and its annual flood was the planting of a new crop of possibility. The blank, muddy canvas left by the cataclysm was now being painted season after season with the richest soil on the planet. This process created a landscape of constant, dizzying change, a dynamic mosaic of shifting channels, temporary oxbow lakes, and freshly fertilized floodplains. A world utterly hostile to the slow, stable giants of the Pebas system. The stupendous turtles and colossal caimans were gone for good. Their static kingdom had been replaced by a chaotic, fertile nursery. The perfect stage, not just for life to return, but for an explosion of new forms, for evolution to run wild. The Amazon basin was no longer a drowned world. It had become the greatest laboratory for life on Earth. And so, the greatest laboratory on Earth was open for business. The stage was set. The raw materials were delivered daily by a river the size of a continent. But an empty lab, no matter how well equipped, is just a room. It needs an idea. It needs an architect. And this is where the story turns from rock and water to life itself. This is where the victim of the great catastrophe becomes its master. Back in the beginning, we asked a radical question. What if the rainforest wasn't the result of the wet climate, but the cause of it? Here, in this new, fertile, chaotic landscape, we find the answer. The first trees and plants that took root in the Andean mud didn't just passively soak up the rain that happened to fall. They began to engineer their own world. They did it with a power that lives inside every leaf, a process called transpiration. A single large tree can draw hundreds of gallons of water from the ground each day and exhale it into the atmosphere as pure water vapor. Now, multiply that by 1 trillion trees, then 1 trillion more. The Amazon doesn't just have trees, it is trees. The result is a biological machine of incomprehensible scale. The forest began to breathe. It exhaled a river of moisture into the sky, a flying river vaster than the Amazon River flowing on the ground below it. This creates a colossal low-pressure zone over the basin, a vortex of life that actively pulls in more and more moist air from the Atlantic, recycling the rain again and again as it moves thousands of miles inland. The forest wasn't just living in a greenhouse, it had installed its own plumbing and air conditioning. It had hijacked the continental climate system for its own survival. And here, the final piece of our great paradox falls into place. The mystery of the wettest world and the driest world, living side by side. The Atacama is what happens when a landscape is governed only by the brutal, indifferent laws of rock and wind. It is a world stripped bare, a testament to geological force. But the Amazon is what happens when life answers back. It is what happens when 1 trillion living things, over millions of years, work in concert to build a paradise out of mud. It is a world not just inhabited by life, but created by it. One is a monument to absence, the other a cathedral of presence. They are not opposites, they are two parts of the same story. A story that began with the violent birth of a mountain range that tore a continent in two, and ended with a forest that learned how to command the clouds. A story that reminds us that while geology may set the stage, it is life itself that writes the most astonishing and triumphant acts.